Charles was crowned King of Bohemia in 1446 and Holy Roman Emperor in 1555. He was the first ruler to hold both titles simultaneously since the days of the great Hohenstaufen emperors a century earlier, and unlike his predecessors, he chose to govern from Prague rather than from a German city. This was a deliberate and transformative decision. By making Prague his imperial capital, Charles elevated Bohemia from a peripheral kingdom to the political center of the Holy Roman Empire, and he set about building a city worthy of that status with an energy that bordered on obsession. The Charles Bridge, begun in 1357, replaced an older bridge that had been destroyed by floods. It was built to last. Massive sandstone piers sunk into the riverbed, wide enough for 2 carts to pass abreast, designed by the architect Peter Parler, who would also oversee the continued construction of St. Vitus Cathedral on the castle hill above. The cathedral itself was Charles' spiritual monument, a Gothic masterpiece of soaring vaults and stained glass that was intended to rival the great cathedrals of France and to house the Bohemian crown jewels in a chapel so richly decorated that visitors described it as a cave of gemstones. Charles University, founded in 1448, was the first university in Central Europe. It was modeled on the University of Paris and was intended to ensure that Bohemia would no longer need to send its scholars abroad for higher education. The university attracted students and masters from across the empire, Czechs, Germans, Poles, Bavarians, and quickly became a crucible of intellectual life and eventually intellectual conflict. The tensions between Czech-speaking and German-speaking faculty would, within 50 years, contribute directly to the crisis that produced Jan Hus. But in the 1350s and 1360s, that crisis was still invisible. Prague under Charles IV was a city in full bloom. The new town, Nové Město, was laid out on a grid south and east of the old town, with wide avenues, planned market squares, and building plots that attracted craftsmen, merchants, and minor nobility from across the empire. The population swelled. The construction industry boomed. Stonemasons, carpenters, glaziers, and painters converged on Prague to work on the cathedral, the bridge, the university, the churches, the monasteries, and the dozens of noble and ecclesiastical buildings that were rising from the Bohemian mud at a pace that contemporaries found astounding. To walk through Prague in the 1360s was to walk through a city being born. The noise came first. Construction was everywhere. The rhythmic chipping of stonemasons dressing sandstone blocks for the cathedral, the heavier thud of pile drivers sinking timber foundations for new buildings in the new town, the creak and groan of wooden cranes lifting loads of cut stone to scaffolding platforms that swayed 30 meters above the street. The air smelled of limestone dust, horse dung, wood smoke, and the sharp tang of the tanneries clustered along the riverbank south of the old town, where workers soaked animal hides in vats of urine and ground oak bark. The old town market, the teen courtyard, and its surrounding streets was the commercial heart of the city. By mid-morning, it was packed. Merchants sold Flemish cloth alongside Bohemian linen. Spice traders offered pepper, cinnamon, and saffron that had traveled overland from Venice or Genoa. Butchers displayed cuts of pork and mutton on wooden boards, while stray dogs lurked beneath the stalls, waiting for scraps. Bakers carried trays of bread, dark rye for the poor, lighter wheat loaves for the wealthy, on wooden boards balanced on their heads. A money changer sat behind a narrow table piled with coins from a dozen different mints, testing each one with a small scale and a practiced eye. The social stratification was visible at a glance. A merchant's wife wore dyed wool and a linen head covering. A noblewoman passing on horseback wore silk imported from Italy and a silver brooch that represented more wealth than the baker earned in a year. A servant girl carried water from the public fountain in a clay jug, eyes down, stepping aside as a mounted knight's retinue forced pedestrians to the edges of the narrow street. A Franciscan friar in a brown robe moved through the crowd collecting alms, his bare feet black with street filth. A Jewish merchant from the walled quarter nearby, Prague's Jewish community was one of the oldest and largest in Central Europe, conducted business through a small window in the wall that separated the Jewish town from the Christian city, a physical boundary that encoded centuries of uneasy coexistence. And above it all, visible from almost any point in the city, the unfinished spire of St. Vitus Cathedral rose from the castle hill, a stone exclamation mark announcing that this city, this kingdom, this moment was something unprecedented in Bohemian history. Charles IV died in 1378. He was 62 years old. He had ruled Bohemia for 32 years and the empire for 23. He left behind a Prague that was, by any measure, one of the great cities of Europe, larger than London, more culturally vibrant than most German capitals, home to a university, a cathedral, a bridge, and a court that attracted scholars, artists, and diplomats from across the continent. He also left behind a kingdom that was, beneath its golden surface, riddled with fractures. The church in Bohemia had grown enormously wealthy under Charles's patronage and enormously complacent. Ecclesiastical institutions owned vast tracts of land. Bishops lived like princes. Parish priests, far from the cathedral splendor, were often poorly educated, poorly paid, and poorly motivated. The gap between what the church claimed to be and what it visibly was had been widening for decades, and Charles's lavish funding of religious institutions had, paradoxically, made the gap more conspicuous rather than less. The university, Charles's proudest creation, was becoming a battleground. Czech-speaking masters resented the voting structure that gave German-speaking faculty a permanent majority in university governance. The intellectual arguments were real. Questions about church reform, papal authority, and the relationship between scripture and tradition were being debated with increasing intensity, but they were inseparable from the ethnic and linguistic tensions that the university's multinational structure had created. The peasantry, as always, bore the heaviest burden. The construction boom that made Prague magnificent was funded by taxes and labor obligations that fell disproportionately to rural communities. The silver that enriched the crown and the merchant class did not trickle down to the villages. A peasant in southern Bohemia in 1378 lived much as his grandfather had lived, bound to the land, obligated to his lord, tithed by the church, and largely invisible to the chroniclers who recorded the deeds of kings and bishops. And the new king, Wenceslaus IV, Charles's eldest son, was not Charles. He was not even a competent imitation of Charles. Where the father had been a builder, the son was a drinker. Where the father had balanced competing interests with diplomatic precision, the son alienated allies with impulsive decisions and prolonged absences from governance. The Golden Age was over. The institutions Charles had built were intact, but the hand that had held them in balance was gone. What came next, the crack, the fire, the war, would begin not in a palace or on a battlefield, but in a chapel, a small, purpose-built chapel in the old town of Prague, designed for one specific and radical purpose: to deliver sermons in Czech. The man who would stand in that chapel and change everything was already alive in 1378. He was a student, probably, a young man from a small town in southern Bohemia, working his way through the university that Charles IV had founded, absorbing the ideas that were circulating through its lecture halls with increasing urgency and decreasing caution. His name was Jan Hus, and the world that Charles IV had built, the beautiful, fragile, unequal world of stones, silver, and saints, was about to meet the one force it could not survive: a man who refused to stop telling the truth. The crack began with a voice. Jan Hus was not the first man to say that the church was corrupt. Reformers had been saying it for decades, in England, in Italy, in the universities of Paris and Oxford. But Hus said it in Czech, to Czech people, in a Czech city, at the precise moment when every fault line in Bohemian society, ethnic, economic, spiritual, political, was straining toward rupture. That combination made him not merely a critic, but a catalyst. From the pulpit of the Bethlehem Chapel, beginning in 1402, Hus delivered sermons that drew crowds of 3,000. He told them the Bible, not the Pope, was the supreme authority of the faith. He told them priests who lived in sin had no right to administer the sacraments. He told them the sale of indulgences, the church's most lucrative product, was a fraud. He said these things not in the cautious, qualified Latin of academic theology, but in the blunt, vivid Czech of a man who wanted to be understood by blacksmiths and bakers and serving women. The church excommunicated him. The university pressured him. The archbishop burned copies of Wycliffe's books, whose ideas Hus had absorbed and sharpened. None of it worked. Hus kept preaching. The crowds kept growing. And in 1414, the Council of Constance, convened to heal the church split between three rival popes, summoned Hus to defend his views. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund guaranteed his safety with a letter of safe conduct. Hus rode south across the Bohemian forest. Within a month of arriving in Constance, he was in chains. The trial was a performance. The verdict was predetermined. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was chained to a stake, crowned with a paper cap painted with demons, and burned alive. His ashes were dumped in the Rhine to prevent any relic from surviving. The men who burned him believed they were extinguishing an idea. They were lighting a fuse. The news reached Prague like a shockwave. 452 Bohemian nobles sealed a letter of protest. The Bethlehem Chapel became a headquarters of defiance. Hussite priests went further than Hus himself had gone. They began offering communion in both kinds, bread and wine, to ordinary laypeople. The chalice became the emblem of a revolution, stitched onto banners, carved into doors, raised above marching columns as the simplest possible declaration that no institution stood between the human soul and God. King Wenceslas IV, weak and ill, died in August 1419, reportedly triggered by the shock of the first defenestration of Prague, in which a Hussite mob stormed the new town hall and hurled Catholic councillors from the upper windows to the street. The throne passed by dynastic right to Sigismund, the emperor who had lured Hus to Constance with a broken promise. Bohemia was expected to accept as its king the man who had betrayed its prophet. Bohemia refused. What happened next had no precedent in medieval European history. A kingdom without a standing army, without a cavalry tradition, without the financial machinery of a major power, organized itself for war against the combined resources of Catholic Christendom. The man who forged this resistance into a fighting force was Jan Žižka, a minor nobleman from southern Bohemia, already in his 60s, already missing one eye. He had fought in border skirmishes and possibly at the Battle of Grunwald in 1010. He was scarred, experienced, and possessed of a tactical imagination that was a century ahead of his time. Žižka understood that the rules of medieval warfare, armored cavalry charges, feudal levies, aristocratic command, were conventions, not natural laws. And conventions could be broken. He took ordinary farm wagons, reinforced their sides with heavy planks and iron plating, chained them together in circles or lines, and filled them with crossbowmen, early handgunners, and infantry armed with flails and polearms. The result was a mobile fortress, deployable on any terrain in minutes, impenetrable to cavalry, and devastating to any force that tried to assault it on foot. The flail, a peasant's threshing tool modified for war, became the signature weapon of the Hussite infantry. Its swinging weight concentrated force on a small point, cracking plate armor that swords could not penetrate. The crossbow punched bolts through steel at close range. The handgun, crude, inaccurate, terrifyingly loud, panicked horses and punched lead through armor designed to stop blades. Žižka did not invent any of these weapons. He invented the system that made them lethal together. The first great test came on July 14th, 1420, at Vítkov Hill outside Prague. Sigismund had assembled the first crusade against the Hussites, a massive multinational army blessed by the Pope and led by the Emperor. They attacked a narrow ridge defended by a few hundred Hussite fighters behind hastily built palisades. The ridge neutralized the Crusaders' numerical advantage. The Hussites held. The Crusaders broke. The first papal crusade against Bohemia had failed. It would not be the last. Over the next decade, 4 more crusades marched into Bohemia. Each was larger. Each carried the full spiritual and financial backing of the papacy. Each followed the same pattern. A massive army entered the mountain passes, advanced towards Prague, and shattered against Žižka's wagon forts. The Second Crusade collapsed in 1421 when Žižka defeated isolated crusader columns at Kutna Hora and Nemecký Brod. At Nemecký Brod, retreating crusaders attempted to flee across the frozen Sazava River. The ice broke. Hundreds drowned in their armor. By 1421, Žižka had lost his remaining eye. He was completely blind. He did not stop. He compensated with an extraordinary command structure. Lieutenants described terrain in precise detail, and he issued orders from a mental map assembled from their reports and his decades of knowledge of Bohemian geography. He rode at the head of his columns, directed battles by voice, and maintained a tactical clarity that sighted commanders envied. He never lost a battle, not once, not blind, not outnumbered, not fighting against the combined military resources of Catholic Europe. Žižka died of plague in October 1424. According to Hussite tradition, he asked that his skin be made into a war drum so he could lead his soldiers even in death. Whether fact or legend, the request captures the truth of his significance. He had become inseparable from the war itself. Command passed to Prokop the Great, a former priest turned military commander who proved nearly as capable. Under Prokop, the Hussites went on the offensive. Raiding armies, the beautiful rides, swept out of Bohemia into Saxony, Bavaria, Silesia, and Brandenburg, devastating Catholic territories and demonstrating that the Hussite threat could no longer be contained within the mountain ring. The Fifth Crusade, in 1431, was the largest and supposedly the most decisive. A massive imperial army advanced into western Bohemia, near Domažlice. The Hussite forces moved to intercept. According to multiple sources, the crusading army heard the sound of the approaching wagons and singing of Hussite hymns and fled. The entire army broke before battle was joined. After 5 crusades and 5 failures, Catholic Europe had to accept what the battlefield had been saying for a decade. Bohemia could not be conquered. But victory against the outside did not mean peace within. The Hussite movement had always contained 2 incompatible visions. The Utrechists, the moderate wing, wanted reform within the existing order, communion in both kinds, Czech language preaching, limits on church wealth. The Taborites, the radicals, wanted a new order entirely, communal property, elected leadership, rejection of church hierarchy. While crusading armies threatened Prague, these factions cooperated. When the external pressure lifted, the fracture opened. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, the moderates destroyed the radicals. Prokop the Great was killed. Czechs slaughtered Czechs on a Bohemian field. 2 years later, the Compacts of Basel gave Bohemia what no heretical movement had ever extracted from Rome: a written concession that communion in both kinds was permissible. The Catholic Church had formally acknowledged for the first time that its monopoly on doctrinal truth had limits. It was extraordinary. It was also the end of the radical dream. Tabor was dismantled. The communal experiment dissolved. The revolution won the war and lost the peace. Or so it seemed in the quiet that followed. For nearly 2 centuries, Bohemia existed in an uneasy but functional hybrid, nominally Catholic, practically Hussite, tolerating a religious pluralism that the rest of Europe would not achieve until 1648. The chalice remained the symbol of Bohemian identity. Czech was spoken freely. Huss was honored openly. Then came 1620, and everything shattered. The Battle of White Mountain was fought on November 8, 1620, on a low chalk hill just west of Prague. It lasted less than 2 hours. A Habsburg army, fighting under the banner of the Counter-Reformation, crushed the forces of the Bohemian Protestant estates so thoroughly that the battle was over before most of Prague's citizens knew it had begun. What followed was not occupation, it was erasure. 27 leaders of the Bohemian Revolt were executed in the Old Town Square on June 21, 1621. Their heads were displayed on the Charles Bridge, 12 of them hung in iron cages from the bridge tower, facing east, so that every person entering Prague from the Old Town side would see them. The message was not subtle. This is what happens to those who defy the Habsburgs. The Czech language was stripped of its official status. German became the language of courts, schools, administration, and public life. Protestant clergy were expelled. The Bohemian nobility, families that had held their lands for centuries, was systematically dispossessed. Their estates were confiscated and redistributed to German-speaking Catholic loyalists imported from across the Habsburg Empire. The University of Prague was handed to the Jesuits. The Bethlehem Chapel, where Huss had preached to thousands, was demolished. The Hussite chalice disappeared from public life. Books in Czech were burned. Churches were reconsecrated. The name Jan Hus became something whispered in kitchens, not spoken in streets. Bohemia did not cease to exist. It remained on maps, a province of the Habsburg Empire. But the living culture beneath the name, the language, the faith, the memory of a kingdom that had told the Pope and the Emperor to go to hell and had backed it up with wagons and flails, was driven underground. 300 years of darkness began. And yet, even in darkness, something survived. In the villages where Czech was still spoken at home, in the folk songs that encoded forbidden memories, in the underground communities of the unity of brethren, spiritual descendants of the Hussites, who passed prohibited texts from hand to hand across generations and borders. Bohemia had been swallowed, but it had not been digested. And the question of why, the structural, cultural, almost geological stubbornness that kept this identity alive through 3 centuries of systematic suppression, is where the next chapter begins. Why did Bohemia survive? Not as a geographic designation. Maps are patient, and empires are happy to keep old names on provinces they have gutted. Bohemia survived as an idea, a language, a memory. A stubbornly persistent sense shared by millions of people across 3 centuries of foreign rule that they were not Germans, not Austrians, not merely subjects of the Habsburg crown, but something else, something older, something rooted in this basin and its mountains and its rivers, something that predated the empire and would, if they held on long enough, outlast it. How? The Habsburgs had every tool of suppression at their disposal. They controlled the army, the courts, the schools, the church, the land registry, and the tax rolls. They replaced the Bohemian aristocracy wholesale. They imposed a foreign language on every institution that mattered. They demolished the physical sites of Hussite memory. They executed the leaders and exiled the intellectuals. By every rational calculation, Czech identity should have died, dissolved into the German-speaking culture of the empire the way Provençal dissolved into French or Cornish dissolved into English. It did not. And understanding why requires looking not at the grand gestures of resistance, there were few, but at the small, daily, almost invisible acts of persistence that accumulated across generations, kept an identity alive long enough for history to turn. The first and fundamental act of survival was linguistic. The Habsburgs made German the language of power. After White Mountain, Czech was systematically excluded from courts, schools, official correspondence, and public administration. Within a generation, any Czech speaker who wanted to rise in society, to become a lawyer, a bureaucrat, an officer, a professor, had to become a German speaker first. The message was clear. Czech was the language of peasants, of the past, of irrelevance. German was the language of the future. And it worked, partially. The Bohemian urban elite became German-speaking. The new aristocracy, imported from across the empire, had never spoken Czech to begin with. Prague's intellectual and commercial life was conducted in German. By the mid-18th century, Czech had retreated so far from public life that some Enlightenment observers, including a few Czechs, wondered openly whether the language would survive another generation. But Czech did not need the cities to survive. It needed the villages. And in the villages, in the tens of thousands of small farming communities scattered across the Bohemian and Moravian countryside, Czech remained the language of daily life. Mothers taught it to children. Grandparents told stories in it. Priests who served rural parishes far from the supervision of German-speaking bishops often preached in Czech because their congregations understood nothing else. Folk songs preserved Czech vocabulary, Czech rhythms, Czech ways of naming the world. The language lived in kitchens, in barns, in fields, in the mouths of people who had no political power and no institutional support, but who spoke Czech because it was theirs, and because no one had yet found a way to reach into a farmhouse and change the language a mother used to sing her child to sleep. This is the pattern that empires consistently underestimate: the persistence of language at the domestic level. You can change the language of the courtroom, the classroom, and the tax office. You can make it socially disadvantageous to speak the old tongue. You can associate it with backwardness and poverty. But unless you physically remove the population, which the Habsburgs, to their credit or their limitation, never attempted, the language survives in the one institution that no state can fully penetrate: the family. The second act of survival was religious, or rather the ghost of religion. The Habsburgs re-Catholicized Bohemia with thoroughness and force. Protestant clergy were expelled. Churches were reconsecrated. The Jesuit order was deployed as the intellectual and educational arm of the Counter-Reformation, taking control of the university, founding schools, publishing tracts, and conducting missions in the countryside designed to root out the last traces of Hussite and Protestant belief.